Bismillah. Okay guys, so in this short video, hopefully it's going to be short, I want to share some of my thoughts in regards to the Atheist Muslim written by Ali A. Rizvi. It's a book that I've recently been going through, and it's basically a book written by an atheist, an ex-Shia Muslim who left his tradition and became an atheist. And he basically writes a book where he shares his thoughts, he shares his opinions, he shares his outlook, he shares his reflections upon the Quran, and he obviously paints a picture about Islam in the Quran which is very far from the truth, but seems to, it's very typical. But what I want to do in this particular video is I don't want to address specific points and give you a breakdown in my view on those specific points. I may do that in later videos. What I want to do here in particular is I want to give you an overview. I will address specific points, a few of them just to give you some examples, but I want to give you an overview and really try to deal with those sort of root foundational points that I believe are the result or what have resulted in him writing the rest of this book and the views that he holds. That being said, the very first thing I want to do is I want to start with the 9th chapter of the book, The Silver Lining. And in this chapter there's a very, very interesting passage where he basically receives a letter from one of his friends who's lost their father. And they basically ask Ali regarding how he makes sense of life and meaning, and especially in particular these situations when you lose loved ones, how do you make sense of this? Do they just become fertilizer for the earth, as his friend writes? And Ali proceeds to share his thoughts in his response, and he basically, when you read it, you see he makes points such as this person hasn't gone anywhere, it's just matter has rearranged into a different form of matter, energy is transferred into a different type of energy, it's still there, and he basically, for a lack of better ways of explaining this, he gives a very scientific explanation to the question, and it's very interesting reading this because, he comes across almost as a naturalist, he reduces everything down to matter, and then he tries to add some sort of emotional colors to this reality, which is very difficult to do because at the end of the day, if it's all just matter, then what's the point behind everything? It's just physical stuff. Emotions, feelings, meaning, purpose, value, all of these things mean nothing. Something I've addressed in other videos, but not the topic of this video. But going back, but what really strikes me about this passage, his response, is that he takes a very optimistic and very positive outlook on his worldview, meaning that when he doesn't understand anything, he acknowledges it, but he's very optimistic. He says, look, ignorance is humbling, as he says in page 220. Admitting ignorance is humbling, so he takes a very, very positive view. However, when it comes to the rest of his book, when he talks about the Quran, he talks about Islam, he doesn't take the same approach. He seems to take a very negative approach. He seems to interpret things in a very negative light. He seems not to be convinced by anything anyone says to him. He has a very sort of negative, cynical outlook on God, on religion. Something that he is evident when you read the rest of the book. Now, when I saw this double standard, it got me thinking, and it really strikes me, and it really got me thinking as to why is this double standard present? Why is it when it comes to atheism and naturalism, he takes a certain outlook, and when it comes to Islam and the Quran, he takes a different outlook? So I started to sort of, inquire about this further, and I believe I found the answer, and the answer or the origins of the answer, which I believe lie in chapter 3, which is titled Letting Go, Part 1, The Born Again Skeptic. Now, in this particular chapter, he shares a very powerful story, and to be honest, I felt a bit emotional when I was reading this because he is a good writer, and he basically shares a story of his cousin who was 3 years old and he was 5 and she was dying. She suffered from a cancer, and she was basically in her last moments, and he's at her bedside and she's passing away, and as a 5-year-old child, he's trying to make sense of this situation. He's trying to understand what's going on. He's asking his father questions. He's seeing his auntie and uncle going through a lot of emotions, really upset, praying to God. Now, first and foremost, before I go any further, I want us to understand something, that we as Muslims and as human beings, we should empathize with not only this situation, but all types of difficulties and trials and tribulations and suffering that we see in the world. And as human beings, we should try to do the best we can to help others. That being said, what seems to have happened, and he acknowledges in the book himself that this was probably the main event that took place in his life, which eventually led him to his skeptical, outlook, his atheism. But what seems to have happened is that he has had this experience and maybe other experiences in his life, which he has later on in his life reflected over, and he has taken the wrong end of the stick. He has misunderstood life. He has misunderstood what's going on. In other words, what he is highlighted here, or what you pick up from his writings, is the problem of evil, right? And what he's done is he's emotionalized the problem of evil in this particular chapter. Now, the problem of evil is basically, in simple words, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, then why is there evil and suffering in the world? Is it that, number one, he is able to remove it, but he doesn't remove it, therefore he is not all merciful and loving? Or is it that he wants to remove it, but he cannot remove it, therefore you can't claim he's all powerful, right? So you can see the sort of dilemma that supposedly occurs there. The thing here is this. First and foremost, I want us to appreciate something. The problem of evil is not an argument against God's existence. It's very important to understand this, right? And it's something that I'm going to share with you now, and Hamza deals with it in The Divine Reality. He writes a brilliant chapter, I believe it's chapter 11 in his book, where he addresses the problem of evil, and I'm going to get to this in a second. But the very first thing we need to understand is that the problem of evil, as Hamza clarifies, it does not deny the existence of God, right? At the most, all it would do is it would lead you to develop a misunderstanding of who God is and develop a hatred, a disliking towards God. That's the most that can happen. That's what seems to have happened with Ali, right? The second point is, the problem of evil is not a problem for Islam. Okay, it's very, very important to understand this. The problem of evil may be a problem for Christianity because the concept of God is very different. They believe God is loving, right? And God is love. But in the Islamic tradition, we know Allah, God, has many names and attributes. And those names and attributes reconcile via His oneness, right? And that's something I'm going to touch upon now. See, the problem of evil has two main assumptions, and it seems like Ali has made both of these assumptions in his book at some point in his life. The first assumption is that God is only loving and merciful, which I've just clarified. God has many names and attributes, and I'm going to touch upon how understanding this removes this problem, right? And number two, the second assumption is that God has no reason to permit evil and suffering in this life. Again, another assumption that Ali seems to have made in his book, or in his life, and which he expresses in his book. Now, dealing with the first assumption that God is only loving or only merciful, this is simply not true. We know Allah, God, has many names and attributes, and I believe if Ali had known this, and I don't know if he knows this, but it seems like he doesn't, then he would realize that, for example, if we reflect over the name of God or the attribute Al-Hakim, the wise, that would mean that wisdom now would express itself in reality, meaning that there will be wisdom behind things that take place, right? Now, just because we as limited human beings cannot appreciate or see the wisdom there, it doesn't mean the wisdom is not there, right? And if you argue, well, no, just because I can't see it, therefore there is no wisdom there, that's just arguing from the perspective of the ego, right? Now, Hamza makes a very interesting point that I want to clarify here, because sometimes what atheists would do is they will say, well, hold on a second, this is a cop-out. You're just saying, oh, there's wisdom there, and you're just trying to, it's a way out for you from this problem. Well, no, not really. And here's how Hamza summarizes it. I think it's a very beautiful way of summarizing. He says, it is not an intellectual cop-out to refer, and this is, by the way, on page 173, he says, it is not an intellectual cop-out to refer to divine wisdom because it is not referring to some mysterious unknown. Rather, it truly understands the nature of God and makes a necessary logical conclusion. And that's how simple it is. It's a simple logical conclusion based on the knowledge of who God is. But for that, you need to know who God is, right? That's the first point. And if we really understand this, then what we'll appreciate is that, yes, we go through hardships and trials and difficult times in our life. And yes, in those moments, we may not see the wisdom behind those things. But that does not mean there is no wisdom there, right? And it happens in our own lives. How many times have we gone through hardships in our life where gone through a really hard time, we've not understood it, but maybe 3 or 4 or maybe 4 or 5 years later, maybe a few months later, you've been in a position now where you look back at your life and you think, if I hadn't gone through that, I wouldn't be where I am today, right? it happens. And this shows us there is wisdom behind things that happens. But we as human beings don't have the ability to always understand that wisdom, right? And if you then argue that, well, look, I can't see it, therefore there is no wisdom there. This is what Hamza refers to as egocentrism. He says, the problem of evil and suffering argument exposes a cognitive bias known as egocentrism. Such a person cannot see any perspective on a particular issue apart from their own. Some atheists suffer from this cognitive bias. Now it seems like, right, I'm not saying it is, it seems like what Ali has experienced and what he is going through. You know, that he seems to want to be able to understand everything that's happening. You know, and you see certain passages as he writes, he becomes very cynical at points. You know, he thinks about certain scenarios and situations and he sort of almost, you know, laughs at God because he thinks, oh, God is busy doing this. When he's done with this, then he'll come and help me here, or he'll do this. You know, he wants God to almost act out in a way that makes sense to him or that he thinks is right, which is it's not the right way of looking at things. Now the second assumption is that God has no reason to permit evil and suffering. Now when it comes to this particular point, again, if we go back to the Islamic spiritual tradition, what we would realize is that indeed God has good reasons to permit evil and suffering. And I want to share a few of those right now with you guys. Now obviously if Ali had understood these and had comprehended these, I'm sure he wouldn't have ended up, you know, where he has ended up today. The very first part of this assumption is that it boils down to purpose. Now let me explain it this way. From the Islamic tradition, we know God created human beings with a very clear, distinctive purpose, which is to worship Him. God says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that He did not create human beings and the jinn kind, but let's focus on the human beings here. He did not create the human beings for no other reason except that they should worship Him. That is the objective. That is the ends, right? And this life is the means for us to fulfill this purpose, to worship our Creator. Now when we understand this reality, we understand what the goal is, right? The goal is not to have a life which is perfect without any problems, without any flaws, without any troubles, without any tribulations. No, the objective is to worship our Creator, to have a relationship with our Creator and to fulfill our purpose. Now if we understand this reality, then if we were to reflect over a person, and Hamza gives a beautiful example of a man that has the most beautiful, luxurious, perfect life. He has no problems, no issues, no difficulties, no trials. His life is so amazing that he forgets to fulfill his purpose, which is to turn to his Creator, to acknowledge Him, to thank Him and to worship Him. When he does this, or when he fails to do this, in the grand scheme of things, this human being has failed. No matter how amazing his temporary life was or seemed, in the grand scheme of things, in the eternity, he has lost out. On the other hand, if you have another person who has a life where he has some good things and every now and then he goes through trials, he goes through tribulations, he goes through hardships, but those trials and tribulations become a window of opportunity, a doorway for that person to turn back to his Creator, to re-establish his relationship with his Creator and to worship God, then those trials and tribulations have become something that are beautiful, something that are beneficial for this human being, because in the long run they have helped him in attaining paradise. And this person therefore becomes truly successful. And you know what's beautiful and amazing is that he acknowledges you see this in his book itself when he touches upon the point that his auntie and uncle, when they lost their child, when they lost their 3-year-old, this brought them closer. It made them stronger in faith, right? It made them stronger in faith. And this is something amazing. This is clear. It shows us that, look, this event in their life brought them closer to God, which is fulfilling their purpose. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, summarized this in a very beautiful way. And I'm paraphrasing, and he said that amazing is the condition of a believer. Everything is good. If something good happens to him, he or she is grateful, and that's good for them. And if something bad happens to them, they go through a hardship or a difficulty, and they are patient, then that is also good for them, right? Because they're expressing patience, they're practicing patience, and they're turning to the Creator, and they're worshipping the Creator, and they're relying upon the Creator, and this is worship, and they are fulfilling their purpose, and hence it's good for them too, right? And this is the Islamic spiritual outlook on life. Now, I recognize if you take a very sort of, atheistic, materialistic outlook, and you say, and therefore that this life is all that exists, we're only here once and we're going to die, if that's your outlook, then if you go through hardships, if you go through trials, if you go through tribulations, I can understand why they will be difficult, why you would see them as something, just really bad, right? I can acknowledge this, but what you can't do is you can't be on both sides of the fence. You can't have an outlook on life which is very materialistic, and then challenge the motives of God from that perspective, right? Take Islam as a whole. If you want to understand, what's going on and why God is doing this, then take the whole picture. Understand the philosophy of life from the Islamic perspective, which is that we're here and we're here to worship our Creator. Another way of looking at that, another point is that we're here to be tested. God makes this very clear. He created us to see which of us is best in deeds. He will put us through tests, and He will test us via the loss of life, the loss of wealth, fear. So we are here to also be tested. God will test us in this life. It's not a party, it's not paradise. And again, if you look at it from the perspective of a materialistic perspective, then yeah, this is your only life, you're only here once, then obviously you want to see this as paradise. This is your paradise. This is your place of party, right? So you just want to enjoy yourself, and when something goes wrong, you can't make sense of it. But from the Islamic world view, the Islamic perspective, there is an objective to life, there is a purpose, and therefore, when we go through hardships and trials and tribulations, they are a part and parcel of this life to help us and aid us in fulfilling our ultimate objective, which is to worship our Creator and to attain paradise. So when you understand this reality, what you will see is that the problem of evil really just breaks down and dissipates from the Islamic perspective. It's not really a problem anymore, right? Now, that being said, I believe what's happened is Ali has not understood, although he claims to be from a Muslim background, he hasn't understood, and I'm not denying this, but he doesn't seem to have understood this reality. He hasn't seemed to have understood the full holistic understanding of what life is from the Islamic perspective, and hence he has ended up with his negative outlook on God and religion and Islam in particular and the Quran itself. And it's this and such events which he has misunderstood in his life, which I believe have resulted in certain filters that he has developed. He's obviously developed a disliking towards God, which is expressed through the book. And these filters are the filters that now he has seen the rest of Islam through. He sees the Quran through, and therefore all of the conclusions and the views that we find in his book regarding the Quran, regarding the verses of the Quran, regarding Muslims, the way he makes links with certain events, certain supposed Muslims have done, and he links them back to the Quran, the way he interprets certain verses, you can see that there is a clear, I wouldn't say an objective, but there seems to be a bias and there seems to be a filter that he has in front of his eyes, which is not allowing him to see Islam for what it really is, and hence making him, leading him to the conclusions that he makes and the errors that he makes as well. Now, for example, just to highlight some of these errors that he has made, if we go to page 178, 179, what you find is that, and he does this throughout the book, but here he refers to a specific passage in the Quran, and he refers to the verse where chapter 5 verse 72, 73, where God says, and I'll read it from his book, God says, there in translation, they have certainly disbelieved who say Allah is the Messiah, the son of Mary, while the Messiah has said, O children of Israel, worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord. Indeed, he who associates others with Allah, Allah has forbidden him paradise, and his refuge is the fire, and there are not for the wrongdoers any helpers. Right. They have certainly disbelieved who say Allah is a third of three, and there is no God except one God. And if they do not desist from what they are saying, they will surely afflict the disbelievers among them a painful punishment. And he quotes these verses, and I'll give you a bit of a background, but he quotes these verses, and then he seems to make a conclusion on page 179 that look, God has a disliking towards people that commit shirk, which is associating partners with God, whether they be Christian or anyone else for that matter. And therefore, how should the Muslims react? Shouldn't the Muslims, and this is the type of conclusion he comes to on page 179, shouldn't the Muslims also treat the Christians as the Christians treated, other religious people throughout history who disbelieved in God, or the correct understanding of God, which is basically what he's insinuating is, shouldn't Muslims kill Christians and do away with Christians and be bad to Christians? And this conclusion is so absurd. When you study even superficially the Islamic tradition, and when it comes to how we should engage with people, our fellow brothers and sisters in humanity, the Christians and the Jews and whoever else, whatever other faith group there may be, is totally different. Now, he's completely ignored, for example, other passages of the Quran. He brings in other passages here which are not related to make his point that the Muslims should, do really bad to Christians X, Y, and Z. But he completely ignores other passages such as where God makes it very clear. In chapter 3, for example, قُلْ يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ تَعَالَوْا إِلَى كَلِمَاتٍ سَوَاءٍ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمْ. O people of the book. God is referring to, when God is saying people, O people of the book, referring to, there's a respect here. God says, O people of the book, come. Let's come and discuss. Let's come to a common word between us and you. Right? And this particular passage, if you look at the historical context, which he seems not to do a lot through his book, if you look at the historical context of this particular verse and these revelations in this particular chapter, this is a time when a group of Christian leaders came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, from Najran. And they came and they stayed, they were hosted at the mosque of the Prophet, peace be upon him. They stayed at the mosque for days and they had a discussion with the Prophet, peace be upon him, about God and the existence of God and God's nature. And if you read this passage, what you see is how God has encouraged us to engage with the Christians and the hospitality the Prophet showed to the Christians. And the Christians, this group of Christians, actually rejected what the Prophet had to say. They didn't accept what he was saying. They didn't accept the message of Islam. And after this, to further develop the point I'm making is how we should really engage with the Christians and the Jews, and something that's well known, the Prophet, peace be upon him, put in place a treaty with the people of Najran, right? And the Prophet, peace be upon him, put many treaties in place. One of the treaties was the Treaty of Najran, and I have a partial translation of that treaty here. I don't know if you guys can see, you can pause the video and you can take a snapshot of this, but I'll just read you a section of this. And the Prophet dictates, and he says, the lives of the people of Najran and its surrounding area, their religion, their land, their property, cattle, and those of them who are present or absent, their messengers and their places of worship are under the protection of Allah and the guardianship of the Prophet. Their present state shall neither be interfered with, nor shall their rights be meddled with, nor their idols deformed. No bishop shall be removed from his office. And then a little further down, the Prophet, peace be upon him, states, neither oppression shall be allowed to be perpetuated on them, nor shall they be permitted to oppress, nor shall they be permitted to oppress anyone. Now, and this continues to read further, but what we see very, very clearly from this passage and other treaties is that there is tolerance. The Prophet, peace be upon him, is saying, to put in simple words, that they should be allowed to continue to practice their tradition. They should be allowed to continue to practice their way of life. No one should harm them. No one should oppress them. Right? Now think about this. Let's really think about this for a second. If the objective of Islam and the Prophet of Islam and the Muslims was to force people, or to become Muslim, and if they didn't become Muslim was to kill them and to do the X, Y, and Z to them, then why would the Prophet, peace be upon him, put such treaties into place? These are historical documents, right? Why would the Prophet do this? It clearly breaks down the view that Ali seems to be pushing in this particular passage, and it shows how it's just not true, right? On top of this, if you look at certain Western historians, such as, I believe, Arnold J. Toynbee, a great historian and philosopher of his time, he basically writes upon the treatment of the Muslims, and he praises the Muslims in his writings, and he says, look, the way the Muslims treated Christians throughout history and other faith groups was amazing, right? We have writings from certain Jews in history who wrote and to their communities to say to go to the lands of the Muslims because of the amazing treatment they were receiving. There are accounts of certain Russian Orthodox Christians who have made statements and have written and have said that the way that the Ottomans treated them compared to, for example, how the Roman Catholics treated them was a difference of night and day, right? The Muslims were praised for their treatment of other people that lived under them throughout history, right? Something that obviously Ali doesn't seem to have considered or hasn't looked at or hasn't researched. But if you look at these things and you study these things and you reflect over these things, you will see the clear picture emerges, which is that Islam, when it comes to other people of other groups and other backgrounds, Islam encourages the Muslims to engage with them in a positive way to share the truth of Islam with them, to share the true message of who God is with them. Because Muslims are encouraged to be people who are concerned about humanity, concerned about their brothers and sisters in humanity, because they want what they want for themselves, they want for their brothers and sisters in humanity. Which is, if Muslims want paradise for themselves, they also want paradise for everyone else. Right? Hence, we're encouraged to engage with people with good speech, with a beautiful speech, with good manners. Read the Quran. Other passages, Moses, peace be upon him, is told to approach Pharaoh and go to Pharaoh and speak to him. God says, Layyina, qawlan layyina, speak to him with soft, gentle speech. This is Pharaoh, who was a Muslim meaning someone who submitted to God and worshiped God alone, being told to go to one of the greatest oppressors on the face of this earth and speak to him softly and gently. Then how should we Muslims be engaging with our Christian brothers and sisters in humanity? The point becomes very clear. I can continue to elaborate on this, but I don't think I need to go any further. And again, he makes other insinuations, and I think the video is going on a bit too long, but I'm not going to go into those. But there are this example and the rest of the book is full of such mistakes, such misinterpretations and misreadings, and it's really sad to see this, and unfortunately. But however, what I would say, just to conclude, I would recommend Ali, that first and foremost, I would really encourage him to study the Islamic tradition properly if he hasn't done already. I would also recommend him to study and to read the Divine Reality, in particular chapter 11, which deals with the problem of evil, which I believe is an issue that he is going through himself. I may be wrong, but this is my opinion reading his book. And I will also encourage him to just, if he's still open to it, to revisit his convictions and revisit his views and revisit his analysis of reality and how he has interpreted and understood life and the world, and what he has, what he thinks of God and what he thinks of Islam. And I really believe if he genuinely and sincerely engages with the Quran and he studies Islam, a lot of his misconceptions, if not all of them, will disappear, God willing, And just to conclude, I thank you guys for watching, anyone that's made it through till the end of this video. For anyone that is interested in learning more about Islam, I'd really encourage you guys pick up a copy of the Quran, and just when you read it and study, if there's passages you don't understand, just mark them, underline them, and take an optimistic look, an optimistic approach, as Ali does when it comes to atheism and naturalism, as mentioned in the beginning. Take an optimistic approach, understand that the Quran is a book which was revealed over 1400 years ago, and it's probably the most extensively studied book on the face of this earth. A verse of the Quran has volumes written on it over the past 1400 years. You can find volumes and volumes of books written on just one verse of the Quran. It's a rich tradition, it's a scholarly tradition. And to do what Ali has done, unfortunately, in this book, which is to, just take passages, and as far as I understand it, he can't speak Arabic, although he can read Arabic. I don't think he can speak Arabic or understand it. He seems to have just taken some translations that he, as he mentions himself in his life, and read those and just come to his own conclusions without actually genuinely, taking a serious interest in studying the tradition and the depth that this tradition has to offer. So anyone that's looking to Islam, I really encourage you to take that type of path, and I hope and I pray that God guides everyone. Until next time, take care.